Great. Hello, everyone. So again, what Stephen was saying, lectins are kind of like this new fad. We've been hearing a lot about them in the news. If you follow like health and nutrition trends, you might have heard about lectins. There's a lot going on here. So this was a really fun talk for me to make because I got to learn a ton about lectins. It's not something that I really did like a deep dive in before this, but it's really cool, the research behind it. So I just want to start out by saying that, my background is in nutrition and functional medicine, and I'm not a huge fan of cutting out like entire food groups, but we are going to go through the research and I'm trying my best to give my most unbiased opinion for this talk. So here we go. Let's see. Let me get, oops, all right. So what are lectins? Like, what even are they? Basically, lectins are a group of proteins that bind reversibly to carbohydrates. So they make up about 30% of our food, which is a pretty large chunk. Looking in the research, lectins were used and still are used in science to help determine blood type, which I found really interesting because they bind to carbohydrates. So what they would do is they would isolate some lectins, put them in a test tube, and they draw blood. You put your blood in there, shake it up, and depending on which specific cells it bound to, they could tell if you were blood type O or A or B based on the carbohydrates. So there is this idea that because these lectins attach to a carbohydrate, they might affect communication. Some of the research says that it inhibits communication. Others say that it's actually helps molecules communicate because they're now stuck together so they can communicate easier rather than communicating over long distances. But the main thing is that lectins are big. They're very big proteins. So when they go through your GI tract, it actually is a little bit damaging. It's a little damaging on the cell lining of your stomach and your intestines, which we'll talk about a lot more in the following slides. So foods that contain lectins, there are a ton of different lectins in a ton of different foods. And we pretty much eat most of these foods on a daily basis. So unless you're, very, very, very strict with your diet, you're probably eating some type of lectins. Legumes tend to be the biggest contributors, things like kidney beans, peas, lentils. Also, some fruit and vegetables. Most of the vegetables are like tomatoes, eggplant, potatoes, peppers, but also any fruits that are not in season. Most fruits are considered high lectin, and nuts and whole grains as well. So things like peanuts, almonds, cashews, wheat. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. Trust me, like I said, it was 30% of our food. So there's a lot of lectins and a lot of different things, but this is just some basics. So this quote is by Dr. Gundry, and he wrote the book called The Plant Paradox. And this book is really what spurred the whole lectin talk, debate, whatever you want to call it, this big uproar in what's the deal about lectins. So he says that the most dangerous trick pulled by lectins is that they bear an uncanny similarity to the proteins on many of our important organs, nerves, and joints. And his idea is that this is an issue because if they are similar to the proteins on those organs, nerves, and joints, they're going to connect to those. They're going to rest on top of them and perhaps affect the communication within our body. So making them not function as properly as they should. Now, Dr. Gundry is a medical doctor. He's an MD, which is, it's good. He was a cardiac surgeon, and he decided to go into preventative medicine after a few years of doing heart surgery. So he was like, you know what, I'm done doing surgery. This is all preventable. These people shouldn't have gotten to this point of needing surgery. How can I get them to not be here? Which, that's very forward thinking for a medical doctor. So it's great. And obviously we put our doctors in high respect. It's really important. Our medical doctors go through so much training. They know what they're talking about, but he's a cardiac surgeon. And I'm going to be honest here, medical doctors do not have formal nutrition training. So a lot of times we see these doctors like Dr. Oz or now Dr. Gundry, or there's tons of other doctors out there that are medical doctors, and they give a ton of nutrition advice. The problem with this is that doctors typically take about 1 semester of nutrition throughout their entire education as a doctor. So they're pretty much at the same general level of nutrition knowledge as most civilians that stay up to date on, the diet trends and the fad diets and things like that. Being a doctor, he definitely knows how to do research, and he understands like higher education and higher thinking, which is great. So hopefully his theories are a little bit more sound than just some random person, coming up with something. But it's important to understand that just because he's a medical doctor doesn't mean he fully understands nutrition. So the problem is that not all lectins are created equal. Some can act as low-grade toxins, where others are harmless, and some have even been shown to be beneficial for us. So the current theory is that certain plants or plant parts contain higher levels of toxic lectins, and this is so that they are not eaten in the wild. Lectins have evolved as part of an organism's defense mechanism. So I like to think of the analogy of like roses. Roses are beautiful, but what's on their stem? Thorns, because roses don't want us to pick them. They don't want to die. So they have these thorns to prevent us from picking them, to prevent other animals from eating them. It's kind of similar to that, where lectins have developed as these toxins so that if someone were to go around and eat them, they're going to say, oh, I don't feel so good. I'm not going to eat that anymore. And now this plant can live a very happy, long life without being disturbed. But there is another theory that lectins may actually stimulate our immune system. So these low-grade toxins that the plant produces to prevent it from being eaten actually help to stimulate our immune system and help us better prepare for a more damaging insult. So if you think about it, small amounts of lectins kind of trigger an immune response. It activates the complementary immune system. And this immune system is the one that helps us to fight pathogens. So a good analogy for this is if you were going to war, you don't want to wait till after the war to get all of your weapons. You would be at a very big disadvantage. So this is like your body storing up all those weapons so that when it needs to go to war, it has them ready to go. And these lectins end up working with our immune system to help us. The important thing to think about here, though, is dose response. So maybe a little bit is a good thing, but a lot could be damaging. That's similar to stress. A little bit of stress in your life actually helps your immune system, whereas a lot of stress is very harmful. So it's important to think about it this way so that when you're looking at, do I need to go on a lectin-free diet? Is lectin-free for me? Should I be eating all the lectins in the world? Let's keep this in mind, that it could be more of a moderation thing to look at. So cooking can really reduce lectins. This is another important part of the whole lectin debate. Cooking foods that contain high levels of lectins can reduce lectin levels drastically. For example, if you soak raw kidney beans overnight like you're supposed to, and then cook them thoroughly for 45 to 60 minutes, like it usually says in the package, you can reduce the toxic lectins by 99%. So do we really need to cut out kidney beans as long as we're cooking and soaking them properly? We'll see. Lectins may also promote longevity, and we're going to be doing a longevity talk next week, so we'll talk more about this then. But a lot of the populations that consume diets that are high in lectins actually contain actually have the longest, healthiest lifespans. So we'll talk about things like blue zones. These are zones of the world where people live very, very long, relatively healthy lives, and lectins are a big part of their diet there. So there is a theory here that lectins alone probably shouldn't be singled out, as a primary cause of chronic health conditions in the US. That's probably not why we have the issues that we have, if you think about it. Maybe it's contributing to it. Maybe too many lectins and not cooked in the right way are contributing to our health problems. But we have a lot of other issues in the US, like all of our processed food, all of the high sugar foods, the low fat diet craze, and just these foods that are produced in a lab that aren't really foods. They're basically pseudo foods, things like Doritos or Cheese Whiz, things that aren't really meant to be in our bodies. So lectins are water soluble, going back to cooking them and reducing them, and they're mostly in the surface of the food. So as long as you soak these foods that contain lectins, which if you go back to ancient traditions, beans were always soaked for about 24 hours. Even most cultures soak their nuts, which nuts are high in lectins as well. So soaking those things before you eat them can help reduce the lectins. Slow cooking is also a really good option. It's reducing lectins is better to cook slow and low than high and fast. So if you have a crock pot, that's a really great way if you're going to be eating foods that have lectins to reduce the lectin content if you're worried about it. But in general, cooking things slow and low is a lot healthier than turning up the heat. Turning up the heat really high and cooking it fast breaks down a lot of other things in the food that's really beneficial for us. So there's a question that just came in. What about canned or frozen beans? So you really need to look at the can and you need to look at the package. If the can says soaked, or it'll say like lectin free, or you always want to, it'll distinguish on it if it has been soaked or if it's lectin free or reduced lectin. It should have it on there. It should tell you the processing that those beans were canned. If they're frozen, they probably weren't soaked. You'll probably need to soak them. Good question though. Do organic legumes need soaking? Sorry, another question. Yes, any type of legume needs to be soaked. It doesn't matter if it's organic or not, because lectins are a compound that's in the actual food. It's not something that's sprayed on them or can be changed based on whether it was gardened organic or not. But legumes always need to be soaked. So let's consider this. If you don't have the enzymes to properly digest certain lectins, consuming those lectins is probably going to disrupt your digestion, right? If you don't have those enzymes, it's not going to feel too good eating them. And then we look at if it's causing this disruption in your digestion, it could be causing some other things, right? Because if it's making your stomach upset, that's probably means that it's causing some damage. And damage in the intestines can cause nutritional deficiencies and lead to inflammatory conditions such as arthritis, asthma, or colitis. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more detail in a second. But without those proper enzymes, lectins can really destroy the lining of your intestines. So are we lectin sensitive? Are you lectin sensitive? Well, majority of Americans have a leaky gut. And if you've ever heard of leaky gut before, I'm going to go, the next slide has some pictures to really help me describe it for you guys. But it's so common now. We have so many chemicals in our foods, even our organic foods still have glyphosate on them, unfortunately. We have a ton of different toxins that are used for pest control, GMOs, genetically modified organisms. We still don't know how those interact in our bodies long term. So there's a really good chance that you are likely lectin sensitive to a point, just because of the general sad standard American diet that Americans have. Leaky gut causes inflammation and a whole range of symptoms that we see throughout the body, which we're going to talk about right here. So if you look, the first picture is a healthy stomach lining. You can see the cells are nice and close together. We've got those little bumps in the top, which is like the villi, that helps to increase surface area so you can digest as much from your food as possible. All great stuff. So this is what healthy gut lining looks like. And then you can see this other blown up picture where the cells are very, very close together. There's no gaps, the villi are healthy, you've got no issues going on. And the next picture is that leaky gut, where you see, oh, those cells are a little bit separated. And what happens is that red piece that's underneath the cells, that's your blood vessel. And those are little red blood cells that are in there. And if you have a leaky gut, now you don't have anything protecting what you ate from going into your bloodstream. So of course, these things have to be very, very small to fit through those. If you think about how small a cell is, the gap between two cells is very, very, very tiny. But either way, it's still too large and it should have been broken down more. But with leaky gut, you have these larger proteins and they end up getting straight into your bloodstream. And the villi become damaged. So that reduces the absorption of the minerals and the vitamins that you normally should get from your food. So leaky gut symptoms are things like anxiety, depression, bloating, gas, if you have a lot of food allergies or food sensitivities, if you have irritable bowel syndrome, even diabetes and insulin resistance, inflammatory bowel disease, a lot of skin issues, hay fever, allergies, the list goes on and on and on and on and on. And most of us have some type of these issues. You know, we definitely have something going on. No one is the picture perfect thing of health, but a lot of these can be attributed to our gut and the state of our gut health. So lectins end up making leaky gut worse because remember I said lectins are big, they're bigger proteins. So now if those are getting through the cells, they're going straight into our bloodstream, and that's causing a whole lot of problems down the line. Just looking at the chat real quick, do you need to discard the soaked water before cooking? Yes, you need to discard that water because that's going to have the lectins in it. A lot of people will even every 6 hours, every 4 hours, will change the water out as they're soaking as well. That helps to reduce lectins even more. So how do lectins and leaky gut affect each other? Lectins get through the impaired gut barrier. Like I said, you saw those little holes, they kind of get through there. And what happens? They cause inflammation throughout the body. Your body responds to proteins. Allergies are a response to proteins that are that your body thinks are foreign. So what happens is your body's going, oh my gosh, what is this protein? I've never seen this before. We must attack it. And if these lectins get through, the body's going to have this response, and you're going to have inflammation throughout the entire body. That's why we see things showing up as skin conditions or as anxiety and depression, because it's inflammation that's not just in your stomach now. Now it's systemic. It's around the whole body. And these lectins actually have an affinity for insulin receptors. So if they bind to the insulin receptors, that means your insulin cannot bind to the insulin receptors, and this leads to things like diabetes and insulin resistance. Circulating lectins can also affect metabolism signaling, which results in weight gain and a slow metabolism. So it kind of disrupts a lot of things, depending on how much lectin is running around your body. So do you need to cut out lectins to be healthy? Do I need to cut out lectins to be healthy? Well, healing the GI tract should be the first priority for any treatment plan for every disease. This is a huge, if I could say this over and over and over again every day of my life, I would. Healing the GI tract is the most important thing. So maybe it doesn't mean cutting out lectins. Maybe it does for you. Avoiding lectins potentially may help to heal the gut and improve a variety of symptoms. Avoiding other GI inflammatory foods, which we have a lot of research on, things like gluten, sugar, even dairy, can also help to improve your gut integrity. So if those things are easier for you to cut out, maybe lectins stay in your diet. If lectins are an easy thing for you to cut out, then maybe, gluten, sugar, and dairy stay in your diet. There's also many supplements that you can purchase over the counter that are targeted to help heal the GI tract. So for example, digestive enzymes are just one relatively cheap example that can help you digest your foods better. But I'm not saying go out and buy a ton of supplements, because that's not always a good idea. And it's always really important to talk to your doctor or another practitioner before you buy and start taking any supplements, because they can interact with a lot of medications. But I am a huge fan of looking to your diet as a first line of defense against any health issues. So removing lectins might not be the end all be all. It's definitely not a very sustainable diet. You saw before all the foods that you'd cut out. I'll show you in a second what foods are left. There's not many. But avoiding lectins could potentially be beneficial, because lectins are also in whole grains. So those also contain gluten, and a lot of people are gluten sensitive. So it's kind of the chicken or the egg. What's happening? Is it the lectins? Is it because you're cutting out other foods that are known inflammators, like the dairy and the gluten and a lot of sugars? Who knows what's really at play here? There's not enough research to really tell us what's going on. We do have research for wheat and gluten. We do have research for dairy, and we do have research for sugar. So those things we know are good, especially if you want to cut, especially if you have any autoimmune diseases and conditions. But again, not that much research on lectins. So who may really benefit from avoiding lectins? Well, there is a little bit of research, mostly anecdotal, and then some lab research based on animal studies that show that autoimmune conditions are one of the top things if you are really struggling with an autoimmune condition and medication hasn't worked, other diet changes haven't worked. A lectin-free diet is probably your best option. Arthritis has also been helpful because if you think about what's going on with arthritis, it's inflammation in the joints. So we've got lectin-free diets can help reduce that inflammation, that systemic inflammation that I was talking about. So likely, yes, they could probably help arthritis. Any type of inflammatory conditions, because again, anything with inflammation, helping reduce the inflammation and healing the gut barrier, which lectins we know do destroy that. So any inflammatory conditions could benefit. And then chronic illness. There's plenty of people out there who have failed lots of other treatments. Nothing's worked for them. They feel like no medications worked, other diet issues haven't worked, other diets haven't worked, supplements haven't worked. So maybe trying lectin-free and seeing how that works for you. What we've seen is there's some anecdotal research. So Dr. Gundry had 102 patients that he decided to put on this lectin-free diet, and he has a specific 6-week protocol. And they did it for 6 weeks, and out of 102, they all had an autoimmune condition. 95 tested negative for their autoimmune condition after the 6 weeks. So again, there's not just one test for an autoimmune condition. Basically, like if they had Hashimoto's, they tested negative for Hashimoto's. If they had lupus, they tested negative for lupus. It was a variety of different autoimmune conditions. And then according to Dr. Gundry, 7 of these patients after the 6 weeks went back to eating their original diets. And again, a couple weeks later, they tested positive for their autoimmune condition. So they went back on the diet and a couple weeks later tested negative once again. So he's saying, look, this is all you need. This is the research. It's anecdotal. I did it with my patients as like a case study. And this diet is turning on and off the antibodies for autoimmune conditions, which that's great, but it wasn't done in a lab. We don't know if there's any other confounding factors. So we can only take this looking at it scientifically so far. But there has been lab research, no human studies yet, but animal studies. And that shows that lectins interfere with calcium, iron, phosphorus, and zinc absorption, and that they bind to the lining of the digestive tract, which can cause some issues. So again, animal studies don't always correlate to humans, but it opens the door for more human studies on this topic. So if you cut out lectins, what can you eat? Well, it's not really that much. It fits on one slide. It's organic meats and wild-caught seafood, mushrooms, cruciferous vegetables like broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts, avocados, garlic and onions, cooked sweet potatoes, leafy green vegetables, asparagus, celery, olives, and olive oil. So it's really not that much to eat. But there are, if you look into Dr. Gundry's diet plans, he has different levels of fully cutting out lectins versus not cutting out so many lectins, and how strict you want to go. And for the less strict, he does allow like pressure cooked beans and legumes, as long as they're soaked and pressure cooked, because that gets rid of a lot of the lectins. But there's really not that much that you can eat on this diet. So my big takeaway for all of the research and all of the information that's in this presentation is that a lectin-free diet may not be for everyone. It's really restrictive, it's difficult to follow long-term, and honestly, it may cause nutritional deficiencies. Because if you are following this diet for a very, very, very long time, very strictly, and you don't have proper supplementation, then you're going to end up having some nutritional deficiencies. Dr. Gundry believes that everyone needs to take supplements to be healthy. I personally don't necessarily agree with that. I think we should be able to get all of our nutrients from our food as long as we're eating healthy. So it's kind of like, what would you rather do? Eat not as many foods and end up having to take, multiple pills a day. But a lot of people are taking this diet to reduce their medication. So it seems a little funky there, that way of thinking to me. But avoiding lectins may help to benefit some. So if you have an autoimmune condition or any type of condition that's really, you've tried everything and it hasn't been working, then this might be a good option for you to start and see if it gives you any relief. The lectin-free diet remains a theory. This is really important because there is not enough research to tell us whether or not this diet is safe long-term, if it actually does what Dr. Gundry is saying it does, and if it's for, all people. If you don't have an autoimmune condition, do you really need to be avoiding lectins? Who knows? But if you have any questions, I know there are some in the chat, so I'm going to read those and I will answer them. But if you have more, you can unmute yourself or you can post in the chat. So this question says, I'm allergic to nightshades, which creates a raw acidic sensibility in the back of the throat. Yes. If you don't suffer from any digestive issues, do you have leaky gut? It depends. I would say yes. It's not, leaky gut is in majority of Americans. It not only is it because of the foods that we eat, but also our environment is a little bit toxic. The air we breathe, the water we drink, it's pretty hard not to have leaky gut, to be honest. And anytime you have any of those like sensitivities to nightshades, like that to me suggests some inflammation going on, most likely related to leaky gut. And then where in foods are the lectins located? So from my understanding is that they're easily drawn out with water, they're water soluble, and they are closer to the surface than they are to the inside. For example, for wheat, most of the lectins are in the hard outer shell. So one of the things on this diet is they're telling you to eat all the white bread you want. And it's like, no, we don't want to eat white bread. White bread we know is not healthy for us. But it doesn't have as many lectins as a whole grain would, because that husk, that outer shell that we incorporate with whole grains is where most of the lectins are. Does anyone else have any questions?
If anyone would like to type their question in the chat, please do. Or if you'd like to unmute your mic, the mics are open for questions.
And I have a question for all of you. I'm curious, after this presentation, have you been swayed in one direction or the other? I went through some ups and downs, being like, lectin-free sounds like amazing. And I'm like, no, it doesn't. Yes, it does. No, it doesn't. So I'm curious to what you guys think.
I try to be as healthy as possible and follow the best diet for someone who's in my situation. Try to stick with some plants and not go with anything that's very high in sodium, because the killer for me is the sodium. So I like to gravitate toward a more healthy, like Mediterranean style diet to keep things up to a healthy level.
Yeah, I agree. The Mediterranean style diet is great, but when you look at it from the lectins perspective, it has a ton of foods
Yeah,
that are high in lectins.
I know. I know. We have, there's one start with an integrative physicians to figure out what's going on with joint pain.
So that's up to you. If you want to go more of like the holistic route, I would definitely speak to someone who's more in like integrative or functional medicine. If you think it's something structural, it's always really good to rule out with like an MRI or an X-ray. But it really depends on like what treatment options you're looking for. If you're looking for pain medication, a regular doctor will be able to give that for you. If you're looking for more of like that alternative side of things, then definitely an integrative physician. And Laura, yes, I agree. That's that's the thing. Is this another flawed theory? There's not enough research for us to really tell, but the healthiest side of things really seems to just be, everything in moderation, lots of water and moderate exercise. And I think that's, you've got it down. You should be teaching. Yeah, so Carla, that was a really good point too that I came across with this presentation is so many people who are vegan or vegetarian were like, well, how am I even like, how can I still be vegan or vegetarian and follow this diet? Because if I can't have beans, then I'm not having protein. And that's why Dr. Gundry, has this like modified approach where you can pressure cook things. But again, beans are a huge food group, and even like peanuts are kind of part of that like legume. And so many people eat peanut butter and on a daily basis, and he's calling it like the worst thing you could put in your body. I'm like, I think I could think of a lot of other worse things that you could put in your body besides peanut butter, but it's a good point because not everyone could follow this diet, especially if they're very strict with vegan or vegetarian for whatever reason. That's good. That's interesting, Carla. I like that. I like your perspective. And you're right, we might find out a ton more. Like with gluten in the very beginning, everyone was kind of like, if you're not celiac, you don't need to be gluten free. And then we, did the research and really found out that gluten actually is very harming to the GI tract. So we might end up finding out that lectins are very harming for our bodies as well. It's a debate. It's still a debate.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things that's open for discussion and then further revisiting. As time goes on, there's scholarly articles published and, always things coming out to publication, but it hasn't been something that's been around long enough for people to really delve into it and dissect it to weigh it with something like a particular diet that's been around for 30-40 years. This is just something that's I started probably hearing about this about 3 years ago with the Dr. Gundry commercials were playing hot and heavy on the social media and on television, and I said, "Oh, there's something interesting to learn about." So this presentation had some very good points and good information in the PowerPoint. Someone, let's see, Laura says, even though it's a new issue, it's funny how suddenly everyone is afflicted with it.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for zooming in today, and I'd like to thank Dana for putting together this spectacular presentation. And if anyone would like to join us on Wednesday, April 28th, same time, for longevity and things one can do to keep a long lifestyle.
Yeah, long and healthy lifestyle.
I thank you, and everyone have a wonderful day.
Thank you
Thank
guys.
you. Bye-bye.